In this group of lectures, I'm going to talk about how qualitative data is analyzed. And I have put this into two lectures. It's not complicated or difficult to understand, but what it is very detailed and careful work, and I want you to take away that lesson. I want you at the end of these two lectures to be able to kind of describe the basic process of analysis and how the data gets prepared, and then the process of coding, categorizing, and finding patterns in qualitative data. And then a general understanding of some different ways that researchers approach creating the narrative to present their findings. Now, you'll remember from a previous lecture that qualitative data analysis is an inductive process usually. And that means that you're starting with these huge amounts of data. And then there's this analysis that goes on and starts over and goes back and forth, and you change things as you move along. We call it an iterative and a recursive process because you go back and nope, that didn't, or I found a better way to code this, and you change it as you go along. So you start with the data and then you categorize it, and with an inductive process you let themes and conclusions emerge from the data. There are some different processes that get used depending on the researchers. This is very much a matter of personal taste. Or personal background, or what the researcher is trying to accomplish by doing this. So I've outlined here some different ways that researchers can approach this, or their styles. Some are very technical or statistic-like. So, and in those cases, when you're analyzing that kind of data that way, you usually have some categories determined ahead of time, and you're trying to go through your data and find evidence of those categories and organize things into those slots. And so that's why it's very technical. There are researchers who use kind of a template style, and this is where they the codes come from the research questions, so and sometimes a protocol and almost a checklist, but they can also change things. So if you're using a template style, you're going along and coding the questions that were answered from your template. But then if you see things emerge, of course, those can be pulled out and expressed. There's what I've called an editing analysis. And this is where what really becomes important in the analysis is the verbatim pieces, the quotes that have come up. So, for example, if I'm trying to show how frustrated a child is with confusing directions or something like that in a classroom, I can go along and pull the quotes from the children that show that give evidence of that particular aspect of the classroom. And then finally, there's an immersion type of style, and this is very, very common in ethnographies, or even where you're describing a situation from different perspectives. And this is where the researcher is immersed in the data and lets the patterns come through, and the researcher in this kind of process actually inserts him or herself into the situation and what's happening there. Researchers always have to keep the research question in mind when they're organizing their data. The chunking is critical because there's just simply so much of it that you have to reduce it and make order of it. But the organization style is very personal, as I kind of described on the previous slide. It can follow the type of data you have, or you could categorize your data. You can lay it out chronologically. You could use themes. Often, previous research can guide what you're doing too. So researchers copy styles that make sense to them, that help them make sense of data. A qualitative researcher has to rely on a lot of personal knowledge and expertise. And please understand, the big takeaway from all of this is that qualitative research allows a researcher to be very creative and very personal, and it is always focused on that main research question. And however the data can speak, the stories can come out. That's the purpose of qualitative research. Today's researchers have access to incredible tools for organizing their raw data. Most use a word processor, of course. Some get very skilled at using databases and spreadsheets and different tools like that. There are incredible tools for coding transcripts. There are tools for organizing different types of data, like video. There are really incredible technical tools out there nowadays. However, a researcher is going to organize their data and present their findings, the data prep and storage is critical. I've talked before about how important accurate transcription is. I've seen researchers use really large margins and squish up the transcription into a column on the page, because that gives them a space to make notes by hand, often this large margin. So that's one style that I've seen used very successfully. Some transcriptions are triple spaced, giving the researcher room to go back and use a highlighter or make notes in between the lines of the transcript. Most researchers use symbols, whether they're their own personal set of hieroglyphics for what they're trying to show, or bolding or brackets or different color font. And these are used, for example, to show breaks and responses and nonverbal events. Keep in mind that all raw data must be stored to keep it private and yet accessible. Electronic storage makes the most sense. Electronic storage is essential if you've got multiple coders or researchers will be working together. And electronic storage also lets you combine the data from different kinds of tools. There is no one process or set of steps for working with qualitative data. What I'm going to describe to you and what you've read about is that in general there can be a process that you follow as you dig through this data and find these rich narratives to answer the research question. But most researchers do start with coding their data in some way. The first step is generally to code it. That process means that I go through it and I mark sections and I note them with words or short phrases or labels. For example, if I have a transcript of an interview with a 10-year-old who struggles with reading, I might decide I'm particularly looking for anything that expresses frustration, anything that relates to self-worth, anything that describes comparison of self to peers, anything that expresses avoidance, etc. And then I would actually go through the transcript and bracket sections and label them with those headings or subjects or phrases. And And you may find also, and this is very common, that you have to use two codes for a phrase. The student may be expressing avoidance and something that relates to self-worth, for example, and so that would have to be double coded. Next, very often, the researcher sums up the similarly coded chunks, trying to get to the essence of what they have in common. And this is where coding, it gets adjusted or new codes are used. I may have coded a statement that shows frustration, but then realize it fits better with expressions of self-worth and it wasn't frustration, or I need to add the code for self-worth. Once the researcher has a good sense of the categories, it's time to group those categories and find patterns, find relationships among them in order to present meaning or explanations. And this is where it becomes really valuable to have this information electronically, because you can simply cut and paste and move things around and take them out of whatever type of data you've captured and combine them. As I mentioned previously, you have to chunk your data. So you try to apply codes to one idea, an episode, pieces, maybe one or two sentences. There are two kinds of labels. You can actually pull these labels from the participants, and these are called in vivo or emic, where maybe the words of the participants end up supplying the codes. Or the researcher can apply labels that make sense from his or her perspective, and these are known as etic labels or etic. It is not at all unusual to have in a large research project 30 to 50 codes initially, and then the researcher combines them or even disregards some of them. You're going to have data that just simply isn't useful in the research question that you're doing, because remember, gathering qualitative data, you are trying to gather everything that you see or hear or find evidence of. Coding is a very iterative process. You spend a great deal of time with your data, going back through it over and over again, and each time you notice different pieces. So this is an incredibly valuable process. You usually start by coding based on the inherent meanings in the data, but then you start to refine it. You will find that you have duplicate codes. So that is usually the easiest place to start, by, fixing those and grouping those. And then researchers go through and code their codes as either the important ones or the major ones, the ones that they really want to emphasize, or minor kinds of evidence. And as I've said before, the researcher could go through and recode the data several times.